Developed by Japanese studio Omega Force, Wild Hearts is an entirely new action RPG with more than just a passing resemblance to Capcom's Monster Hunter series. There's no disguising Wild Hearts' inspiration here really. You accept missions, you track down colossal beasts roaming the land, known as kimono, you battle through day and night, alone or in online co-op, until your target is slain, and then you scavenge their remains, mine the environment for resource, and forge even higher stat weapons, armor, to take on even tougher foes. So, going in, absolutely, you know exactly what Wild Hearts' hook is. But there's a twist here. Unlike any Monster Hunter game to date, Wild Hearts targets only the newer generation of consoles and PC. That is, we have a PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S release, with zero last-gen responsibilities to hold Omega Force's ideas back. And the payoff is clear too. We get beautifully realised vistas, highly detailed giant creatures, object destruction physics, and a push for some seriously heavy on-screen effects in battle. All combined, the result is honestly often quite eye-catching. With all of this in mind then, does Wild Hearts really do enough on its own terms? Mechanically, visually, is this truly a next-gen, so to speak, Monster Hunter in spirit? Or are there too many lingering bugs, technical issues on high-spec consoles like PS5, Series X, or even a top-end PC? Secondly, how well does the game run on its 4K and 30fps mode on console, and indeed hold to 60fps in their performance modes? And lastly, what's the state of the Series S version, the 4 teraflop machine, given Series S only has one way to play at 30fps with clear visual cutbacks as well? Let's find out. First up, let's look at the highlights and certain downsides to Wild Hearts as it stands at launch. Developed using the Katana Engine, a newly branded tech from Koei Tecmo, there's no denying the quality of Wild Hearts' art direction. The icy tundras of its opening tutorial, the shrines of the Minato hub area, the coral reefs of the Natsu Kodachi Isle, it's all incredibly varied. There's this rich colour palette to every biome, with a rolling time of day, procedural cloud generation, and physics-based elements. The concept art behind each kimono is also brilliantly translated in-game. Every one is a spectacle, covered in climbable fur, and a tangle of vines and petals. These are walking, breathing hybrids of plant and mammal that morph into multiple forms, dragging you to different sections of the map. And the combat, it's spot on. Every strike delivers a satisfying crunch and snap, punctuated by heavy effects and shader work. Plus, there's an ability to build objects, crates, springs, barriers on the fly to transform the battlefield. And in fact, PS5 goes a step further, sweetening the deal with a very light use of adaptive triggers for the final blow. With all of that said then, it's hard to overlook Wild Hearts' visual shortfalls. These are constant gripes that get in the way of what should be a visual showcase. Firstly, texture work sadly doesn't hold up to scrutiny when viewed close. Even on PS5 or Series X, asset quality for moss, wood and brickwork use distractingly low resolution maps at times, and in fact, Xbox Series S uses even lower resolution textures than the premium consoles, producing some glaringly blurry surfaces. Certainly, in the heat of action it won't notice, but in getting from A to B, there are some obvious rough spots. And likewise, the method of screen space reflections, SSR, is low quality for all three machines. A flickering, pixelated, low-resolution mirror image with a huge gap around occluding objects. Again, Series S gets a particularly raw deal here with an even lower accuracy setting than PS5 or Series X. More on this later in the video. Textures and reflections fall short then, which brings us to point number 3, the shadows, or I should say the lack thereof. On PS5, Series X, and especially Series S, you'll notice global shadow maps are missing entirely for elements of the scene. Here's PS5 as an example, and to be clear, this happens regardless of which mode you use, so the 4K 30fps resolution mode or the 1080p 60fps performance mode, they're both affected. Notice how parts of the environment, characters, creatures, and the terrain itself produce proper shadow maps, And these shadows roll across the terrain according to the day-night cycle, just as you'd expect. But then for other crucial bits of scenery like plants, flagpoles, and these huge stone pillars, shadows fail to engage entirely. Even ambient occlusion is missing on PS5, Series X, and S at times in these open areas, all of which means fields of flowers go unshaded. They're left raw and don't blend properly into the scene. It creates this visual clash, a disconnect between the geometry, materials, and these transparent elements. And it doesn't end there. Shadow pop-in is another huge issue in general, with world shadow maps flickering on and off based on the camera viewpoint. So, I realise I've spent more time dragging Wild Hearts through the mud than praising it, but the fact is, these issues undermine some of the strong art direction Wild Hearts has to offer. Okay, one last issue to mention here, the temporal anti-aliasing. Regardless of console, the TAA method produces some of the worst motion banding I've seen in recent memory. Anytime your weapon overlaps with, say, detail-dense textures, you'll see this banding effect. Even more outstanding is the way this TAA method combines with sub-pixel elements like bushes in the distance, which instantly turns just these elements into a blurred mess. All of which looks rather odd, doesn't it, when the rest of the image is mostly clear. One more point while we're here, Wild Hearts' motion blur, which is enabled by default, has a bug. Sadly, on PS5, Series X and S, making any small nudge to the camera stick during this snowy tutorial section instantly blurs the screen. It looks off, like a Vaseline filter. And even at its best outside of this snowy segment, I found the blur's rather heavy impact makes the action harder to read. So for this analysis, I've actually opted to switch the motion blur off for all versions, just for clarity and comparison. To the comparisons then, and to be clear, we have two modes on PS5 and Series X. There's a resolution mode that targets a native 4K at 30 frames per second, and this does genuinely hit a native 3840 by 2160 in some pixel counts. However, there also appears to be a dynamic element to this. In some cases, one or both of the axes of the 4K pixel structure will halve, leading to 1920 by 2160 or 1920 by 1080 as the base image in taxing areas. It's often masked by the TAA, and honestly, the result never looks as sharp as it could. Meanwhile, there's the performance mode on PS5 and Series X. This is my honest recommendation just for sheer playability, a consistent native 1080p in order to target 60fps. The caveat is that cutscenes still lock at 30fps in the performance mode, and they continue rendering at 1080p regardless. So yes, 1080p is quite a hit to image quality too, I realise, and it's hardly the next-gen dream coming true. But for an action RPG, I'd say prioritising 60fps makes the most sense. Otherwise, settings between the two modes are the same. On PS5, for example, you get a matching preset for SSR, foliage density, shadow quality, draw distance for geometry all stay in place between the modes. It's just resolution and frame rate targets that change. Suffice to say, PS5 and Xbox Series X get both modes, and yes, the visuals are broadly speaking identical across the two premium machines. Between the textures, SSR, shadow quality, lighting, you name it, they both have parity. However, there are two major exceptions, two differences that favour each machine. First up, it's bad news for PS5 users. At least as of patch 1.02, there's a bug affecting image quality on PS5, not present on Series X or S, causing the pixel structure to flicker on its 4K resolution mode. This pixel crawl artifact affects some areas more than others, though sticks out most glaringly around the Minato hub shrines. Even while stood perfectly still in fact, any long high contrast edges like this tend to flicker. It's almost as if there's an issue with the upscale to PS5's 4K mode as it switches between different resolution values. Comparing the PS5 version to Series X directly then, the result is a temporarily unstable image on Sony's machine in places, in the resolution mode at least. Though, in fairness, the opening area before reaching the hub really doesn't reveal this issue at all. And to be clear, there is a workaround. If we switch over to the 1080p 60fps performance mode, this pixel crawl artifact is cleared up on PS5, and image quality matches Series X. So all signs point to a bug on PS5, which I hope gets fixed. Which leads us to the second issue, the dialed back ambient occlusion on Series X. You may have spotted it already, but Series X has cutbacks in ambient shading in specific spots, stripping the scene of some much needed depth. Be it around the opening woodland tutorial or even the shrine interiors, shading is at times drastically pared back on Series X, creating a visibly lighter appearance, while for other areas it's maintained. Here's a great example. Notice the shelving with the vases behind the counter here. Each vase is properly shaded on PS5, but left raw on Series X. It makes this scene look two-dimensional and flat, and likewise for the bags of food on the right. Shade goes missing around the edges on Series X. And oddly enough, this applies regardless of which mode you use, performance or resolution mode on Series X. All of which leads us to the Series S situation. I'll be very blunt here and say Series S is very hard to recommend right now. The visual cutbacks and the lack of any mode toggle between 30 and 60 FPS are hugely disappointing. You get just one way to play instead, at 30 frames per second, running at a native 1600x900 resolution. The upside is that there's no flickering pixel crawl artifacts as with PS5, but that's not enough to save it. So where do we begin here? Well, comparing to Series X on its resolution mode, there are several key drawbacks, the first being the texture resolution. Series S appears to use low resolution assets for parts of the terrain, creating this blurry soup-like result. And honestly, it sticks out like a sore thumb in cutscenes, falling closer to expectations of a last-gen release at times. The best theory as to why this is Series S's 10GB of GDDR6 RAM is a limiting factor, especially stood next to Series X's 16GB of RAM. But still, it's a huge shame to see such a downgrade. The second drawback to Series S, that'll be the absence of ambient occlusion. It's stripped back significantly further than Series X in select scenes, which in itself is obviously already pared back next to PS5. So, for Series S, what this means is, entire environments like this cave section go entirely unshaded, leaving this raw, bright, flat-looking result. The time of day is exactly matched, and yet, this removal of AO practically transforms the scene, especially for interiors. Added to that, there's other cutbacks on Series S. Notice how screen space reflection accuracy takes a visible hit. The resolution and coverage is dialed back, creating a thinner, more pixelated appearance to the mirror image. And likewise, running through this central temple market area, Wild Hearts' global illumination setting also appears affected on Series S. What this means is light bounce doesn't engage properly across the red painted woodwork on Series S, and even the red carpet here as it does on Series X. And so again, Series S's stripped back presentation creates a plainer, less vibrant end result. With all of that in mind then, you'd hope all of this puts Series S in good stead for a solid 30 FPS. So on that note, let's switch tracks to see the state of frame rate. And first up, a quick word on the PC situation, because as of current testing, the PC version has its own fair share of issues in performance. We're running Wild Hearts here on an RTX 4090, an i9-12900K CPU, and more than enough RAM to make 4K at max settings possible at 60 FPS. Sadly though, the issue is pretty clear, the presence of hitching or shader compilation stutters. Whatever you'd like to call it, there's no ignoring the huge frame time spikes down to 100 milliseconds and lower. It's a shame to see yet another engine, the Katana Engine in this case, falling foul of the same issues that blight so many others. Now, Omega Force has promised performance updates are coming alongside DLSS and FSR support, so there is hope on the horizon for PC, but we'll just have to wait and see. Jumping over to console performance, let's kick off with PS5 and Series X's 30fps resolution modes. Starting with PS5, the situation is pretty straightforward. It's a locked V-Synced 30fps experience with scarcely any sign of frame pacing issues. So then, if you want a locked, stable frame rate, this is the way to go. The drawback being, of course, that PS5 suffers from pixel crawl artifacting in this mode, which isn't an issue on the 60fps performance mode. And equally, there's an argument 30fps modes benefit to some degree from some level of motion blur. In Wild Hearts' case though, in my view anyway, the motion blur option is just a bit too heavy-handed to recommend. Still, it is available if you do want to smooth the camera motion. In general though, PS5 runs without issue in this mode, barely a hitch or hiccup across hours of play at 30fps. Switching over to Series X next, the turnout isn't nearly as positive in its own 30fps resolution mode. The crux of the problem is this mode runs with uneven frame pacing on Series X. Despite hitting a solid 30fps, mostly, the implementation of the 30fps cap is different to the Sony version. Frame times oscillate between 16, 33 and 50 milliseconds, causing the perception of frame rate drops, even if in fact there are none. It's a classic problem, triggering more so with any fast action and quick movement across terrain. And honestly, it's not clear why Xbox Series X is affected where PS5 just isn't. It makes the mode less pleasant to play than it should, and goes down as a clear weakness for the Series X release right now. And another factor here is the higher rate of visible frame time spikes, especially around the shrines. These tend to go down to 160 milliseconds and under, just as certain lighting effects engage, which again isn't an issue on PS5. Speaking of uneven frame pacing at 30fps, let's move to Series S next. The bad news is that, much like Series X, the 30fps cap on Series S has the same issue. Frame times bounce up and down on the left side graph, and so it never feels especially smooth in motion. The real sting in the tail being for Series S, obviously, is that 30fps is really all you've got. One mode at 30fps, no alternatives. So, stacking on top of the long list of visual downgrades, having uneven frame pacing makes Wild Hearts on Series S even harder to recommend. And it's a shame, because the actual stability of the frame rate is completely on point. It's not dropping to any obvious GPU or CPU strain during battle or taxing areas. In fact, even the frame time hiccups on Series X to 160 milliseconds aren't an issue here. But still, it's a disappointment, and really, it's a shame 60fps wasn't at least offered as an option, even with drops, where a VRR supporting display might have helped. Last up is the 60fps performance modes on PS5 and Series X. It's a native 1080p, but the upshot really is the performance mode is vastly more enjoyable to play at double the refresh. It's far from perfect. On PS5 and Series X alike, expect a bulk of open world roaming to run at 60fps with some minor drops. However, the first island you're exposed to is the biggest stress test by far, with lots of foliage, complex geometry, and some frankly huge kimono bosses spewing effects across the scene. And it's just as we enter battle that PS5 starts showing its limits, putting us between 40 and 60fps. Adding extra ally players into the mix perhaps gives us the lowest reading here too, but still the hub area and the second island, starting at the shoreline, really don't drop to nearly the same extent in battle. So even with its issues, for PS5 users this is a clear preference, with or without a VRR supporting display. Moving on, the state of Series X in its own performance mode actually mirrors PS5 quite closely. Again, mostly 60fps, and again, the climax to battles on the first island tips us over to the biggest drops, down to the low 40s. It's far from ideal. Now, due to the variable nature of these kimono fights, with the rolling time of day and so on, it's pretty hard to match Series X and PS5 up. Still, I found a route through the hub area that just about does the trick. Charging through the temple at pace, we have evidence here that PS5 runs at a higher average frame rate overall, at least for this section. We're seeing a divide of up to 10 to 12 FPS at peak in PS5's favour, though in practice, outside in the wilderness, on a mission, there isn't such a wide gap in typical play. So again, for Series X, the turnout for 60fps play isn't spectacular, it still needs work, with drops hitting hardest during action, but it's certainly a clear upgrade over the uneven 30fps in the other mode, and with some help from VRR supporting displays, it's salvageable. That about covers all the bases for Wild Hearts. The parallels with Monster Hunter are clear in its mission design, no question, but the extra steps developer Omega Force takes to make the game excel visually and mechanically do give it an identity beyond Capcom's work. The ability to build structures on the fly to aid you in battle is a nice touch, and the art direction at points at a distance impresses. Sadly though, there are a number of visual bugs that need addressing, plus the ambition of its ideas, the huge complex kimono creatures especially, are a drain on performance for even PS5 and Series X. A watertight 60fps is off the cards for both premium machines, but it's a clear preference over the 30fps modes on each. And, meanwhile, the Series S version is sadly saddled with a string of cutbacks and compromises and is stuck at 30fps with uneven frame pacing. It's one of the hardest Series S versions to recommend since we started our next-gen coverage, with it being so stripped down in every area. And honestly, I hope Omega Force loops back to rectify some of its biggest problems, especially the frame pacing. But that's all from me today. Sorry for the croaky voice on this one, I've been recovering from a cold here. But if you did enjoy the video despite that, do feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.